during part of his PhD, he was working for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife here in this area, where he worked for 14 years. And his work is focused, as you know, from his talk yesterday, on the ecology of growing shrimp in these bays in particular, and aquaculture as well. He's currently an ecologist for the Agricultural Research Service, part of USDA. And he is, like Dr. Tamaki, conducted some of the seminal work on species here in the Bay. So please give him a good welcome. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brent. I was laughing because quick succession is kind of, it took me quite a while to get through all 3 degrees, but go dogs. All right, so, and I'm sort of put to shame by my colleague here that just gave his talk, but I have been studying them for a long period of time. So these are 2 species here, mud shrimp, Upigibia pugicensis on the top, and Neotropaea californiensis on the bottom. And as Akio mentioned, they burrow deep, create deep burrows in the sediment. I'll talk about that in just a minute. We have some other species as well. We have the Neotropaea gigas, the giant ghost shrimp. We don't know a whole lot about it, but it is becoming more prevalent out here. And we also have an introduced species on our coast, the Asian mud shrimp, Upigibia major, down in California so far, but one doesn't know from San Francisco, presumably introduced in San Francisco Bay, but it's been spreading a little bit around that and is in a couple other estuaries down there, California. So the mud shrimp, Upigibia pugicensis, builds a burrow similar to the mud shrimp over in Japan, but not quite as deep, we don't think, but probably up to at least 1 meter depth at times. And they can be quite dense, up to 200 burrows per square meter. And the ghost shrimp, Neotropaea californiensis, they're typically found in the upper intertidal, but all the way down to the subtidal zones, predominantly in sandy sediments, but that's in part because they create that sandy sediment. And they typically burrow at about 50 centimeters depth, but they can also go much deeper. As you see here, this burrow on the your right-hand side is about 1 meter deep. They have 2 openings, a small Y shape at the top, and then chambers down at depth. And we've heard about this. They're very significant in our estuaries. They turn over the sediment, which is the issue for shellfish aquaculture. But they also ventilate their burrows and create oxygen exchange with depth. I'm not going to talk about that much. And as we talked about yesterday, they turn over the substrate, and that affects bivalve shellfish, particularly oysters and juvenile seed oysters that you see on the bottom. And Katrin talked about this yesterday for our shrimp, but this is work by, oh yeah, amen right there. Thanks. By Steve Ferraro and Faith Cole, actually, who have studied this in great depth and actually created their periodic table for benthic invertebrates, macrofauna. It turns out, and done that for oysters as well as shrimp and eelgrass, and they are all 3, as we sort of talked about yesterday, ecosystem engineers. We didn't talk too much about the oysters. The ghost shrimp I've highlighted on the top here, and I don't know if you can read it there, but it's number of species at the top of macrofauna, their abundance, and then their biomass. And you'll note that ghost shrimp are really low there, which Katrin mentioned yesterday. There are 5 species typically, and abundance was low relative to the other habitats. In fact, very similar to open sandy habitat with no dominant shrimp, no shrimp present there. Mud shrimp are much higher, and they actually lump together with Zostrom rhini. You see in the table down here that they have they lump together. So similar shaded species lump together. So here's Zostramine and oyster habitat. Actually, I'm sorry. Mud shrimp are down here. They're separate from those. But here are at the lowest. They sort of create their own as open sand and ghost shrimp habitats. So not very many species there. And this is some work by Jeff Hossack on epibenthic species. So not just benthic macrofauna in the sediment, but epibenthos as well. And open mud here actually was dominated by shrimp. And there's only a couple species of arpenticoid copepods over here. And in the Ogres, there's a lot more species and fed on by juvenile salmon and others. And oysters also have more species of epibenthos. So they're also important food web components. And, again, I'm not going to talk about this. Maybe I should have after the talk by Akio. But they're found by green sturgeon, and Kim Patton has done a bunch of work on this as well as my colleagues at the University of Washington on the pits that they dig as well, and significant predation on our shrimp here as well. But probably not as, we haven't done as much population assessments over time that Akio showed for the stingrays over there. Staghorn sculpins, other things predate on them, and also gray whales. And then humans, but this comes from over in Japan actually. Humans actually do feed on them over there, recreationally harvest mud shrimp anyway. So this is my long 30-year history. It's actually 31 now, plus 10 years in other estuaries of sampling shrimp in our estuaries. So this is right out here in Willapa Bay. We sampled several locations, including one where we took Akio last night, right out here at Goose Point, rather, or mud shrimp. Again, doing that. And here are the abundance records of our two species of shrimp through time in Willapa Bay. So when I started my work back when, they were at about 200 per meter squared, ghost shrimp, and they increased in abundance to almost 500 per meter squared. And then they dropped consistently up through about 2008 or so, and now they've increased recently. And I don't have the last 2 years. We just collected 2019, and I didn't get 18 on here either, but they continue to increase a little bit here as well in the last 2 years. And then mud shrimp sort of fluctuated around 100 shrimp per meter squared, or a little over 100 shrimp per meter squared, and then dropped dramatically in about 2002 to nothing at the site we were monitoring. So we moved to off of Goose Point, and they declined there as well. So now you have to sort of hunt and peck to find them out there, although they have increased on some of the oyster brewers' beds, so you can find them out there at higher density in some places. And the primary reason for the mud shrimp decline, we're pretty sure, and this is just correlative, is that they have an isopod that was introduced as well, the it basically castrates the shrimp. It gets underneath the carapace here, and it sucks their blood, and they are unable to reproduce. The females shrimp are unable to reproduce. They don't deposit eggs. So John Chapman has assessed sort of populations up and down the coast. John Chapman and I'm just looking at the historical record, and they pretty much collapsed in these estuaries for some reason. They're still abundant in Yaquina Bay. We don't know why. Probably recruitment, local recruitment, which I'll talk about in a minute. And they're virtually extinct in Bodega Bay, California, down south. I'm not going to talk too much more about that. So here's ghost shrimp, the current issue, and this is our long-term record. So as I said, I've been monitoring now in other estuaries to the south because I'm down here in Yaquina, and these estuaries are on my way up here to Willapa Race Harbor. So we monitored them for 10 plus years, and their populations were very low when we started monitoring, but they've all increased in all of those estuaries in recent years, except for the Aquina. They were still high down there when I started monitoring, and they've declined over time and then increased recently. Of course, on shrimp beds, that's you know, I've been monitoring most shrimp beds. This will come out later too, mostly dense shrimp colonies. In oyster beds, you couldn't raise an oyster on any of the beds, even when the density was low here, because we figured, and Steve's going to talk about this probably, that there's some threshold at which you can't raise oysters, which is somewhere around 10 shrimp per meter squared or 20 shrimp per meter squared, and these densities even here were higher than that. We've also mapped the population in the entire estuary in 2006 and 2007. And then we went back to this area here and monitored it in subsequent years. So here's the density in 2006, then 2011, 2014. So lots of shrimp all over this big area out here. They declined in abundance, sort of like I showed in the graph set at a single site. And then they've been increasing again. We haven't been out since 2014. So here's their life history here. And so the adults are in the estuary, although there are some offshore on occasion as well. We're not sure about the species ID, but we found them at depth off of Oregon. And they have eggs that develop, about 12,000 eggs, 2 to 12,000 eggs per female. And these larvae are out in the nearshore coastal ocean from June through October. So again, larval development for the 2 species, but I'm talking mostly about ghost shrimp. It's about 50 days in the hatchery. It depends on temperature. Caitlin did some of this work. And their distribution offshore is close to shore, relatively close to shore, within 10 nautical miles of shore. And that's also shown in this graph, some work by Steve Morgan and Jennifer Fisher as well, for a whole bunch of species that they catch in plankton samples offshore. And here's ghost shrimp here, and they're quite abundant near shore, and along with barnacle larvae and a few other things that hang out, grapsid crabs and stuff that are near shore animals. And then, you know, here's Dungeness crab that go all the way out to the shelf break. So where do they go? You know, how far can they go? And are we getting shrimp from other estuaries? This is the only genetic, population genetic analysis that I have. But we did some stuff with adults to see using microsatellites. We wouldn't probably do that now, but microsatellites were the tool. And found out that those populations potentially go from Crescent City up to here. So those larvae could theoretically distribute all the way up the coast here from amongst the estuaries. It doesn't prove that, but that's where the break was. Fairly common oceanographic break, actually. And then south of that, they seem to be different in Humboldt Bay and further south. So they can go a long ways, and I talked about this yesterday as well, but how they get back to the shore is depends on nearshore coastal oceanography and the California current ecosystem. So they're out there during the, well, actually it's different for the 2 species as well. So they are both out there ghost shrimp, I'm sorry, are out there during late spring and summer months and into the early fall and winter. And so what you need during both of those is a reversal of currents, because normally their larvae would go offshore out here, but you need those reversal events for them to get back into the estuaries. And we haven't done the depth distribution stuff, the Loch Ness toes that Akio spoke to for ours. But we have looked at the return of decapodids back at least to Aquina Bay. And it's highly variable. So in these 2 years, we saw a big shift in 2 species, it turns out. So on this axis is the number of host larvae, decapodids coming back into the estuary. And You can see that the axis is very different label here. So in 2010, we had very few mud shrimp coming back, but we had lots of ghost shrimp coming back here. And there's a shift in timing as well. So mud shrimp come back much earlier, and ghost shrimp come back all the way through November here in the fall. And that differed by year. So in 2011, we had lots of mud shrimp and fewer ghost shrimp, so the axis changes here as well. And where do they go once they get back into the estuary? This is also work in Yaquina Bay, where we surveyed the broad mudflat, which just has the 2 shrimp species present out there. And ghost shrimp recruited back to open habitat broadly, and also to ghost shrimp, where ghost shrimp were already present. Did not seem to recruit to mud shrimp habitat. Then in 2011, we looked at this again and found out that we had a few recruiting to mud shrimp habitat. Mud shrimp didn't recruit anywhere out here, couldn't make it even, presumably. They seemed to be very attracted to where the adults were, where adult mud shrimp were present in both years. All right, so that's that. So this is recruitment, and that for ghost shrimp happens anywhere from July through November months. And here is the long-term record of ghost shrimp recruit, well, both species to Willapa Bay. We were monitoring this, and so really high abundance, lots of recruits when we started monitoring, and when the adult populations were high in the 1980s up through 2000, and then I could hardly find any to do experiments on for a period of about 10 years, a decade or so. And then here's recruitment starting at about really 2010 or 11, and it's been high, but fluctuating since. And Kim has some numbers for 2019, and we do too, but we haven't counted them yet in the sample. We just took some this year, but it's going to be somewhere in between here, I would guess. Not as high maybe as these 2 years. And here it is up and down the coast, again, only through 2017. But that trend of recent recruitment also goes all the way from Grace Harbor to Yaquina Bay here south, right there. Okay, so what does that mean for shellfish growers? Growers, well, I should say Willapa Bay and Grace Harbor growers experience very high and consistent, almost annual shrimp recruitment in the late 80s and 90s, and then we saw a big period where they didn't have much recruitment. And shrimp populations declined, at least outside of the beds. That's one of the other points. I haven't been monitoring very much on oyster beds. And then it's increased in recent years. And here I've gone back in a couple of years where I didn't have it and actually estimated what recruitment was based on one-year-old animals the subsequent year. So there are some other considerations. Here's eelgrass, some other things to think about. Here's the eelgrass distribution in 2006 or 7. And here's the oyster bed distribution. And here's shrimp. A couple things about that. So burrowing shrimp covered about 8% of the tide flat in 2006. Again, I did not survey oyster beds because we couldn't get the hovercraft out across oyster beds was the main reason. But they conspicuously do not overlap much with eelgrass. We did not assess, as I said, we didn't assess it in oyster aquaculture beds nor model that effect, but it seems likely that shrimp control has actually increased eelgrass presence in areas of shellfish culture. And then also another important consideration are predators on shrimp. Are they causing things, or did they once cause the shrimp populations to be lower, such as sturgeon, but also even staghorn sculpins, which we aren't monitoring their populations. So I already talked about this. So what I haven't done is monitored on shrimp beds, and that's my plan, or on oyster beds. And so that's kind of in my current plans, is working with the growers and monitoring more on what's going on what's happening on oyster beds. But we did go out in 2011, right, as recruitment began, and then again in 2015 and then 2018, and looked on oyster beds. Again, on oyster beds, shrimp density is lower. The average is lower than it is on in an adjacent dense shrimp bed, not surprisingly. Those weren't very different. And what I expected was, as those populations increased from 2015 to 18, that we would see an increase on oyster beds. We didn't see that on average, and we actually saw a decline over time on the outside of the beds, oyster beds, areas outside of oyster beds. But that varied widely from place to place. So you had actually places where it increased on oyster beds. So we know from talking to the growers that shrimp have recruited to some of those areas and are taking over those their oyster beds, and they've lost beds. So I'm really interested in continuing to monitoring that process and what's going on, and comparing those beds where you're losing your beds to areas that don't have that issue. And I still think it's a good approach to learning more about the recruitment of juvenile shrimp and movement of adult shrimp and predation on shrimp as well. How can we enhance juvenile mortality in beds via whatever mechanism? And that is written into my new USDA plan, which talks about shellfish, aquaculture, burrowing shrimp, and eelgrass, as it turns out. Because one of the things I haven't done on an ecosystem sort of scale is look at the effect of shrimp on eelgrass. We never put shrimp into the model when we were looking at eelgrass and oyster stuff. I've never really incorporated that shrimp data that we collected across that broad scale into what those effects are on eelgrass, and maybe even taking it back in time, as Dick Sheldon was talking about yesterday. What was it historically, and how could that change again, and how has that changed even since I've been working out there as the shrimp have fluctuated in abundance? So the intent is to look at eelgrass again now and see if that's changed as the shrimp have started to increase again. And that's it.